Hi, my name's Michelle Alexander, and I'm the author of The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And I really could not be any more thrilled to speak to you today as you begin this books and breakfast program, taking on books that allow you to explore the roots and history, the context of how we arrived at this moment in our history, a time when millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, are now cycling in and out of our prison system or trapped in a permanent second class status and find themselves at the mercy of the police, and often killed for the most minor of infractions or crimes for reasons that seem inescapably tied to race. Um, I wrote this book in the hopes that it might help to empower people who had a feeling in their bones that there was something eerily familiar about our criminal justice system and this system of mass incarceration, eerily reminiscent of eras that we supposedly left behind, but who may have lacked the facts or the data and other information that would make it possible to prove their suspicions and connect the dots between slavery, Jim Crow, and the system of mass incarceration that we have today. And so the fact that you're picking up the book and talking about it and exploring it with one another just is so incredibly encouraging to me. It gives me great hope that we will, in fact, rise to the challenge that this moment in our history presents and build a movement, a powerful, radical movement to end not only mass incarceration, but to break once and for all this history and cycle of creating incredibly punitive, oppressive systems of racial and social control in America. I was first inspired to write this book by my experiences working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate at the ACLU. I was representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison as they faced one legal barrier after another to their supposed reentry. And I had a series of experiences during this time that I called my awakening. I began to awaken to the reality that our criminal justice system now functions much more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. And these experiences led me to do an enormous amount of research and study over a period of many years. And what I learned in that process literally blew my mind. I learned that there are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. I learned that as of 2004, more African Americans were denied the right to vote than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the old Jim Crow era of racial segregation, black folks were kept from the polls by poll taxes and literacy tests. Well, today in many states, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. And in many large urban areas today, more than half of working age African American men have been branded criminals and felons and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. They can be denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, and legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and basic public benefits. So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind during the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. And many people imagine that the explosion in incarceration rates over the past few decades have been driven by crime and crime rates, but that's simply not true. Our nation's prison population quintupled, not doubled or tripled, quintupled in a 30-year period of time. We went from a prison population of about 350,000 in the 1970s to now well over 2 million people behind bars today. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. It is a penal system unprecedented in world history. But this can't be explained simply by crime or crime rates. During the past 30 years, crime rates have fluctuated. They've gone up, they've gone down, and today, as bad as crime rates are in some parts of the country, crime rates nationally are at historical lows. But incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains the sudden explosion in black incarceration rates in the United States, the birth of a penal system unlike anything the world had ever seen, if not crime or crime rates? Well, as I explain in the book, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, a wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States on the heels of the civil rights movement. A vicious backlash against the civil rights movement came to the forefront at precisely the same moment that inner city communities across America were suffering from economic collapse, creating the perfect storm. And out of this storm, a new prison system was born, and poor people of color were stripped of basic civil and human rights, the very rights that Dr. King and Ella Baker and so many others risked their lives for, and some even died for. We have millions of people now branded criminals and felons, relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. And much of this has been driven by a drug war that has targeted poor people and people of color, deliberately targeted poor people and people of color, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. This data has been available for decades, and yet policymakers and politicians have stood by as communities of color have been decimated by a drug war that has been aimed at nonviolent, relatively minor drug offenders for the most part. More than 40 million people have been arrested since the drug war began and relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. And billions of dollars have been redirected from education and economic investment and job training into simply locking up millions of poor people of color and throwing away the key. The unrest that we have seen and the courageous, bold, beautiful protests that we have seen in Ferguson and from coast to coast in recent months in response to the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Tamir Rice and many others. These bold, beautiful, courageous protests about these public lynchings of black men in the streets reflect, I think, the beginning of a much larger awakening to what has been going on in this country for far, far too long. Just like lynchings was not the only thing wrong with the old Jim Crow South, but merely the ugliest, most horrifying reflection of the Jim Crow system. Today, the police killings of unarmed black men are merely the ugliest, most horrifying reflection of a much, much larger system of racial and social control known as mass incarceration or the prison industrial complex. And I think it's so essential that as we build this movement to end these police killings and police brutality that is so rampant in many of our communities, that we connect the dots between this lethal police violence and the much larger system of violence and racial and social control that it reflects. I'm so grateful for the work that really began in Ferguson, on the streets of Ferguson, with young people who were not going to allow Michael Brown's body to just lie in the street for 4 hours while the authorities scrambled to get their story straight, and who took to the streets and were willing to face the tear gas and the riot gear and the grenades and all the rest in order to tell the world that Black lives do matter. And in the end, at the core of this whole system of mass incarceration is the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. Some lives just don't matter. And until we see how that belief, which was written into our original Constitution, which said that, Black people counted as only 3/5 of a human being, that idea that somehow Black lives don't matter, which was part of our founding document and has been reborn in different forms over and over again throughout our nation's history. It is that idea we must challenge in all of our movement building and organizing and advocacy work, and engage in this consciousness raising and advocacy in a way that will help to ensure that we don't just end police killings, and we don't just end harsh mandatory minimum sentences, and we don't just get rid of boxes on employment applications asking people, have you been convicted of a felony? We don't just reform this system, we dismantle it and birth a new system that can genuinely be called a justice system, one that rests on the premise that all of us, all human beings, have dignity and value and ought to be guaranteed inalienable human rights, including the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Those were the founding ideals of this nation, and the denial of those basic rights to African Americans has been this nation's enduring paradox. I believe, I have hope that the movement that is brewing from coast to coast today can, in fact, end mass incarceration, just as our people once rose up and fought and ended slavery and Jim Crow. We can do it again, but this time, as we fight and engage in nonviolent, courageous, revolutionary action to ensure that, in Dr. King's words, America is reborn, is born again, to ensure that as we engage in this work and this advocacy, that everything we say and everything we do is aimed at ensuring that no system of racial and social control is ever born again in America. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I want to thank the Ferguson organizers and activists for just being such an inspiration to me and to people throughout this nation and around the world. Thank you, and I hope that at some point in the not too distant future, our paths will cross and we'll have the opportunity to work together. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing about how your discussions have gone.